So in regard to channeling, I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit, okay? So what channeling is, really basic, is bringing something through and letting it run out, okay? So your channel on a TV, a radio dial, we're channeling food as we eat it and process it through our bodies. Everybody's channeling all day, every day in different ways. And so when we're talking about it in metaphysics, a person is shifting their energetics, hopefully to the alpha brainwave, which is how you bring in higher consciousness, okay? A lot of people hit alpha brainwave when they're really focused on work. Ironically enough, you hit alpha brainwave when you're watching TV. And so you're bringing in energetics, and then you're allowing it to move through you. And as a channel, your job is to basically step back and allow that being or consciousness to utilize your body to communicate, okay? And it doesn't just have to be verbal communication. A lot of channeling can be, for example, like Reiki. People are channeling energetics from higher consciousness. There's all different versions of channeling. It's simply bringing energy through, consciousness through, and delivering it out to, your audience or self. And we're going to talk a bit about channeling. So some of these things I'm going to reference. I watched a fabulous video by Teal Swan. She's a lovely teacher. She's quasi-psychology, metaphysics. And she refers to channeling as possession. And that's a very interesting reference. So as a professional channel, I have to play devil's advocate because channeling is something that I think is rarely communicated about in a fair way. And maybe it's because a lot of channels don't want to maybe admit to themselves or just bring it out in the opens that there's two sides of channeling. And it's very important to be aware and discerning about channeling when you're tapping in and calling in beings and letting them possess you, or you're receiving their information and believing it as a truth. So one thing about that thought is possession, that's heavy, right? When we think of possession, we think of negative entities that we don't like, and we want to get rid of them. So if one is going to let an energy or an entity that for the most part is unseen, for many of us, we're not clear, we're just trusting, utilize your most sacred personal space, I hope we would be really clear about what we're bringing in to filter that, okay? And so that's important to understand because there's different ways of communicating. So channeling is very specific to the human that channels stepping back in a way in their vessel and letting the entity or the energy come through. And the more they can do this, the better of a channel that they are. But there's other ways to bring through energy. So for example, in sessions, let's say I call in a deceased grandmother, and I don't really want her energy in my energetics, but I want to talk to her, just like I'm going to talk to you. So I'll talk to her and I'll relay, like a translator, to the client what they're saying. And that's different, because now we've got energy boundaries, right? And so that's different. But channeling is definitely letting their specific, what I call a baseline frequency, run through you. Your baseline frequency is your average energy that you vacillate in and out of every day. It's kind of like how people know you. They might feel you, and that can range depending on if we're happy or sad, okay? So anyhow, number one, channeling, like it or not, is possession, okay? And as we said, you receive the frequency like a radio. So everybody channels. It is my belief that we are born with ESP, extrasensory perceptions. We are taught out of it, okay? In my belief, most of the kingdoms of Earth use ESP. The crystalline kingdom, animals, plants, what have you. It's an extremely efficient, very universal language. It bypasses verbal language, right? So you can communicate so much more. And it utilizes all the senses. So that's a big part of what you use for channeling. Now, the more you can tune your dial into the all that is, the more you can clearly channel. Now, the most common beings that come through when you begin to channel are usually the ones you do not want to channel. That is because, for the most part, you have a third dimensional body. That's your density. You may be working, especially if you're in here, to awaken and elevate your consciousness, your soul, your spirit, into fourth dimensionality. That's a higher density. It's lighter. Most of the beings that are not what you want, what I'm going to call negative polarity, are fourth dimensional. So very simply put, they're the closest frequency range. It's the easiest for your dial to tune into. And they're like any bad Joe you don't want to know. They're going to lie to you, right? Yeah, I'm Archangel Michael, ooh, you know? So what do? You learn to identify frequency signatures. You learn to understand, that feels a little creepy. That's off, you know, even though they're saying that. And so you really start to read frequency, very important. Okay, so consciousness streams exist in higher dimensions. So when we're channeling, unless we're trying to channel somebody who's crossed over, because they might not be in fifth dimensionality, that would be different. But for the most part, I would prefer always to bring in fifth dimensional beings or above. And these are the ones that we call in usually anyway, the angels, the higher guides. They're in higher dimensionalities, okay? So when you're channeling, depending on the channeler's consciousness, depending on how much work I've done and how much I've cleared for the most part, that's really going to make a huge difference on the channel that's conveyed. Because when you're channeling, the most difficult things to master is get your ego out of the way, right? Because the channel has to filter through you. So that means, the being has to filter through you. So if the channeler, if this human has limited perspectives, if I have very specific belief systems, if I'm in my ego or I'm in a bad mood, that might, the being coming through, it has to go through those filters. So it could be you're connecting to a really high resonance being, but it's coming in super staticky and kind of their words are a signature to the human. Now they do use your language, obviously. It's really impressive if a channel can open up to other language, light language, or other concepts that they've never understood. That means they're really pulling their ego out of the way and just being a pure channel. So that's important because par none, every channel has issues pulling their ego out of the way. I mean, after all, we're egoic beings, right? So that's something to understand, that as you're listening to channeling, you have to decipher what is the being and what's their ego filter. Another huge one with channeling is your doubt. If I'm doubting that my channeling is clear, or if I'm doubting that I'm conveying what the beings are saying purely, that's going to create a static. In my experience, when I'm doubting, that's when I'll slip up in my words and it'll start to come in a little bit like I'm trying to grab the word, I can't quite hear it. That's because I've stepped back in, my mind's starting to process, and I'm literally not hearing what they're saying because I'm in my head, right? Just like communicating. Okay, so the more we can shift our frequency and align with the being, the more pure you bring it through. Now, no language exists through space and time. Hence the reason you can technically channel everything and anything that exists in consciousness. Technically, you can channel a spoon, right? Look at the matrix image of that. If it has consciousness, if it has energetic frequency, you can communicate and channel that energy because we are all energy, all right? The best channels have the ability to disidentify with who they are in a way and let that being just come through their vessel. And if the channeler itself, as I've said, has a low frequency, the being's not going to come through very purely. And something that's really important that I think people need to advocate for themselves is even if it's a super pure channel, these beings exist in a dimensionality where they're usually not limited, okay? Most of them have not ever had an incarnation as a human. That's a big deal. Okay? So they can give you advice and their interpretations up the wazoo, but if they haven't had experience with these limited suffering experiences, heartbreak, tragedy, death, and the way we experience it, you know, they're not necessarily going to really be able to empathize completely. They're compassionate, right? And they offer you information that usually does assist you to awaken and ascend, though from them, this limited reality that they perceive we live in is an illusion. They perceive our reality as an illusion. So be aware of that, because often it can be a little bit debilitating when you're receiving really elevated information, but the gap of you reaching that experience is so vast, that can be depressing. But remember, you have to advocate for your human reality, because they may have never had an incarnation, right? They were born in 6th dimension. Come on, you know? So that one's really important, because I found a lot of people put a lot of weight into channeling. But you have to remember, our suffering's very real to us. We have to transcend it. They exist out of it. Okay, that's a big one. So when you're listening to channeling, your best bet is to use your intuition. Follow how you're feeling. Does it resonate with you? And know that it might go in and out, because a being's moving through a filter. So it might get real clear for like 5 minutes, and then maybe they're having a thought, and then it's a little muddled. So you have to, take what works for you, leave the rest, okay? Now, something that's a little bit more advanced in regard to this type of talk is it's important to understand, just like there's humans that you might not want to engage with, as we've talked about, there's beings you might not want to engage with. There's energetic agendas that we don't want to invite in. And because they exist in unseen realms, 4th dimensionality and above, that's the biggest upper hand they have. We can't see that clear as day, right? So even if a channel is really pure in a high vibrational zone, which really amplifies it, and they're bringing in a really high level being, if an external energetic agenda comes in to bombard, interference we call it, just like white noise, then that may sabotage the channel as well. And sometimes, and this one's very important, this is something I don't think people talk about at all. Sometimes when somebody's channeling a high-level being, they're tuned in and they're clear, and it's a pure communication. And then unbeknownst to the channel, because maybe they're not super-duper clairvoyant, or they're really pulled out of their space and just running the energy, an alternate agenda entity comes in and steps in and takes its place unbeknownst to the channel. And that one is elusive. That one's really tough to gauge, and it's tough for a channel even to identify that at some time. So you really have to go with your intuition and your gut. And so in regard to that piece, how it's a mixed bag of truths and untruths sometimes, right? It's important when you're receiving anything really in life to be aware of how to protect your energetics, okay? So if you understand that your free will is one of your most powerful tools that you have in this existence, your free will is so powerful. There are laws of free will in this universe that cannot be broken. And when beings break them, there's big consequences energetically. They might trick you into agreeing, right? That's a big one. They do that a lot. They ask for permissions, So be aware that even when you're receiving information and running energetics, you still have a responsibility to your health to have protections. Keep yourself safe. I love to use, and Rose uses all the time, Archangel Michael. He offers shields of protection. You can see it as like his big shield. I see it as a circle shield, like old school armor, and you scale it up. So it's like snake scales all around you. You can do that all day, every day. I use the violet flame all the time, because in the violet flame of transmutation, it's a high frequency. Violet is the highest frequency of color that the human eye can see. So if you utilize violet flame, and let's say I call in a being and I'm clairvoyantly viewing them, If I place them in the violet flame, and I always do, even the archangels, if they're false or low frequency, they will muddle out and static out like a hologram. If they're a high vibrational being, they'll amplify, they get much brighter. And violet flame does not intrude in other people's free will. So be a violet flame warrior. Violet flame everybody all day long, right? Because all it does is either amplify the energetics, which everybody can benefit from, or it clears out what you don't want, right? And that's how you can cleanse a crystal as well. You can violet flame it for like 5 minutes straight. It'll clean it.